My sister lived in Salt Lake City, and I hadn't seen her in over a year. Work kept me busy in Denver, and she was dealing with her own life stuff, a messy divorce, custody battles, the usual drama that comes with untangling a 10-year marriage. When she called in March of 2015 and invited me to come visit for a long weekend, I jumped at the chance. The drive from Denver to Salt Lake is beautiful but long, about 8 hours through some of the most remote country in the American West. I'd made the trip dozens of times over the years, usually stopping in Moab to stretch my legs and grab coffee before the final push through the desert. It's the kind of journey that makes you feel small against all that empty landscape, all those endless horizons. Jessica had been dating someone new for a few months. For the sake of the story and personal reasons, I will call the guy Rick. So, they met at her gym. She was excited for me to meet him, kept talking about how different he was from her ex-husband, how much better he treated her. I was happy for her, but also protective. She'd been through hell during the divorce, and I didn't want to see her get hurt again. What I didn't know was that Rick had a history Jessica wasn't aware of. 2 previous relationships that had ended with restraining orders. A pattern of escalating control and violence that he was skilled at hiding during the early stages of dating. He'd learned to be charming, attentive, romantic, right up until he wasn't. I arrived in Salt Lake on Friday evening, and we had a great weekend together. Rick seemed nice enough, though there was something about the way he watched Jessica that made me slightly uncomfortable. The way he steered conversations away from her friends, her hobbies, anything that didn't include him. But Jessica seemed happy, and it wasn't my place to say anything based on a vague feeling. Sunday morning came too quickly. I had to be back at work Monday, so I left early to beat the worst of the traffic through Denver. Jessica walked me to my car, and we made plans for her to visit me in the summer. Rick stayed inside, said he wasn't good with goodbyes. The drive started normally. Clear skies, light traffic, my favorite playlist keeping me company through the first few hours. I stopped for gas in Grand Junction and grabbed a sandwich for the road. Everything was routine, peaceful, exactly what a Sunday drive should be. Around 2 p.m., my phone started buzzing with calls from Jessica. I was in a dead zone with no signal, so they went straight to voicemail. When I finally got back into coverage area an hour later, I had 14 missed calls and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. The messages were, "Call me back right now. Something happened with Rick. I'm scared. I need help. Please answer your phone." I pulled over at the next rest stop and called her back. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her, but slowly the story came out. Rick had flipped out after I left, accusing her of talking bad about him, of trying to turn her family against him. The argument escalated quickly into something much worse. He'd grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the kitchen wall, screaming that she belonged to him now and no one was going to take her away. When she tried to call the police, he smashed her phone and locked her in the bedroom while he figured out what to do. Jessica had managed to escape through the bedroom window while Rick was in the shower. She'd run to a neighbor's house and called 911, but Rick was gone by the time police arrived. They'd put out a BOLO alert for his car, a black Honda Pilot with Utah plates. I told her I was turning around, that I'd be back in Salt Lake in 5 hours. She begged me not to come, said Rick had been asking questions about my visit, about where I lived, about my car and license plates. She was afraid he might try to intercept me on the road, but I couldn't leave my sister alone and scared. I told her I'd be careful, that I'd stick to main highways and call her every hour. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already seen a black Honda Pilot in my rearview mirror twice since leaving Salt Lake, both times staying just far enough back to avoid suspicion. The third time I saw it was outside Moab, where I stopped to use the restroom and buy coffee. The Pilot was parked across the street from the gas station, and I could see someone in the driver's seat watching me. My hands were shaking as I paid for my coffee and walked back to my car. Rick had been following me from the beginning. He'd left Jessica's house right after I did, staying far enough behind to track me without being obvious about it. His plan was simple and terrifying. He was going to eliminate what he saw as the threat to his relationship with Jessica, her protective big sister, who might convince her to leave him. I called 911 from the gas station, but what could I tell them? A black Honda Pilot might be following me on a highway where dozens of black Honda pilots traveled every day. The dispatcher took my information, but couldn't send help to such a vague location covering hundreds of miles of remote road. The next 70 miles were the longest of my life. The pilot stayed behind me, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden behind other traffic or over hills. I tried speeding up, slowing down, taking exit ramps at the last second. Nothing worked. Rick was patient, experienced, clearly not his first time stalking someone. He made his move on a stretch of highway outside Cisco, Utah, where the road cuts through a narrow canyon with high rock walls on both sides. No cell service, no exits, nowhere to run except forward or back. Rick sped up and pulled alongside me, then swerved hard into my lane. I managed to avoid the first impact, but my car went into a skid on the loose gravel shoulder. Rick followed, ramming into my passenger side door and sending me careening toward the canyon wall. I overcorrected and spun across both lanes, ending up sideways in the middle of the highway with my engine dead and steam pouring from under the hood. Rick parked his Pilot perpendicular to the road, blocking both lanes of traffic. He got out with a tire iron in his hand and started walking toward my car. Later, investigators would find zip ties, duct tape, and a shovel in his vehicle, evidence of what he'd planned to do with my body in that remote canyon. What saved me was pure luck. A Utah Highway Patrol trooper happened to be running radar from a hidden position about a mile back. He'd seen the whole thing unfold and was already en route with lights and sirens when Rick made his move. An officer arrived just as Rick was trying to break my driver's side window with the tire iron. Rick spun around with the weapon raised, and the officer shot him twice in the chest from 20 feet away. Rick died at the scene, his blood mixing with the motor oil leaking from my destroyed car. The investigation revealed the full scope of Rick's obsession. His apartment was covered with photos of Jessica, printed from her social media accounts. Maps of her daily routes to work, to the gym, to the grocery store. Plans for isolating her from friends and family, including detailed notes about me and my weekend visit. Jessica blamed herself for months afterward, convinced that she should have seen the warning signs, should have protected me somehow. But how do you see that kind of calculating evil when it's wrapped in flowers and romantic dinners and promises of forever? I never did make it back to Salt Lake that weekend. My car was totaled, and I spent the night in a Moab hospital being treated for whiplash and shock. Jessica drove down to get me the next day, and we held each other and cried in that hospital parking lot. She moved to Denver 2 months later, and now we're both more careful now about who we trust, who we let into our lives, who gets access to our routines and our vulnerabilities. My daughter started kindergarten that September in a small town outside Pittsburgh. One of those places where everyone knows everyone, where the high school football team is front page news, and the biggest excitement is usually the annual corn festival. My daughter was nervous about making friends, so I promised her ice cream after school every Friday if she was brave and tried her best. The elementary school was only 6 miles from our house, but the route took us down a winding 2-lane road that cut through farmland and forest. Beautiful in the fall, with the leaves turning colors and the morning mist hanging over the fields. It was the kind of drive that made you grateful to live somewhere peaceful, away from the chaos of the city. I'd been making that drive twice a day for 3 weeks when I first noticed the blue pickup truck. It was usually parked in the driveway of a rundown farmhouse about halfway between the school and home. Old Ford F-150, rust eating away at the wheel wells. I later found out the name of the man who drove it, but this story I will call him Dale. That's not his real name, by the way, though I didn't learn that until after everything happened. 42 years old, unemployed since the steel mill closed, living in his deceased father's house with his girlfriend and her 2 young children. He'd been drinking heavily for months, struggling with depression and anger issues that his family had been trying to get him help for. On October 13, 2018, Dale had a fight with his girlfriend about money. She threatened to leave and take the kids with her. He started drinking early and didn't stop until he got in his truck till evening, right around the time school let out. I was running late that day because my daughter had forgotten her lunch, and I'd had to drive back to the school with it. The afternoon pickup line was longer than usual. Some kind of flu going around had kept half the kids home. so the remaining parents were all bunched up together instead of spread out over different arrival times. My daughter climbed into the back seat chattering about one of her friend's birthday party next weekend, and whether she could get her ears pierced like the older girls in 3rd grade. Normal kid stuff that filled the car with warmth and made the drive home feel like the best part of my day. We were about 2 miles from the school when I saw the blue pickup truck in my rearview mirror coming up fast. Too fast for a residential road with a 35 miles per hour speed limit. I moved over to let him pass, assuming he was late for something important. That's when I noticed he was weaving slightly, crossing the center line in small corrections that suggested impairment. The truck didn't pass. Instead, it settled in behind me, matching my speed exactly. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up slightly, it sped up too. My daughter was still talking about the birthday party, oblivious to the tension I was starting to feel. At the next intersection, I turned right instead of going straight toward home. The pickup followed. I made another right turn, then another, taking us in a complete circle that brought us back to the main road. Still following. Now I was scared. I pulled into the parking lot of a small grocery store, hoping the public location would discourage whatever was happening. The pickup pulled in behind me and parked directly behind my car, blocking me in. Dale got out. He was tall and thin, wearing dirty jeans and a flannel shirt that hung open over a stained undershirt. His hair was greasy and his eyes had that glassy look of someone who'd been drinking all day. He walked up to my driver's side window and knocked on the glass. I didn't roll it down. Through the closed window, I could hear him yelling about how I'd cut him off, how I was driving like an entitled suburban bitch, how people like me thought we owned the roads. None of it made sense. I hadn't cut him off. I'd moved over to let him pass. My daughter had stopped talking and was staring at the man outside our car. She asked me why he was so angry, and I told her to put on her seatbelt and look away. I was trying to call 911 when Dale pulled out a gun. It was a small revolver, chrome-plated, probably a .38. I'm a kind of into guns, so I know about guns. Anyways, he held it low at his side so other people in the parking lot wouldn't see it immediately. But the threat was clear. He wanted me to roll down the window. I started the engine instead. Dale stepped back and raised the gun, pointing it directly at my face through the glass. Time slowed down in that horrible way it does when you realize you're about to die. I could see every detail of his face, the way his finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot shattered my driver's side window. The second shot went through the windshield, missing my head by inches and embedding itself in the headrest behind me. My daughter was screaming. I threw the car into reverse and floored it, not caring that Dale was still standing there. The car hit him as I backed up. Not hard enough to kill him, but enough to knock him down and make him drop the gun. I spun the wheel and peeled out of the parking lot, glass falling from my hair and tiny cubes of safety glass covering everything inside the car. I drove straight to the police station with my daughter sobbing in the back seat, and my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The 911 operator stayed on the line with me the whole way, asking if we were hurt, if I could describe the shooter, if I knew why he'd targeted us. Dale was arrested 20 minutes later, still lying in the grocery store parking lot with a dislocated shoulder and a blood alcohol level of .19. The gun he'd used was stolen. He had no criminal record beyond a few DUIs, no history of violence, no reason to have targeted me and my daughter specifically. During the investigation, police discovered that Dale had been having paranoid delusions for months, convinced that suburban families were moving into the area to push out working-class residents like him. He'd been following random cars with out-of-state license plates, taking down license numbers, making lists of what he called invaders. My car had Pennsylvania plates. We'd moved from Philadelphia 6 months earlier for a job opportunity. To Dale's alcohol-soaked, paranoid mind, we represented everything he hated about his changing community. The fact that I was driving a newer car on a road he'd traveled his whole life was enough to trigger a psychotic break that nearly killed us both. My daughter didn't speak for 3 days after the shooting. When she finally started talking again, it was only to ask if the angry man was going to come to our house. She still flinches when cars pull up behind us too quickly. We moved away 2 weeks later, Back to the city where strangers don't follow you home from your child's school. Dale pleaded guilty to attempted murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He wrote me a letter from jail, apologizing and saying he didn't remember much about that day. I still check my mirrors obsessively and take different routes home, even though we live hundreds of miles away now. I used to think the worst part of my job was the alarm clock screaming at 5:30 a.m. Every morning, same routine. Stumble to the coffee maker, check my phone for traffic updates, throw on yesterday's clothes. I was a claims adjuster for a small insurance company in Los Angeles, and my territory covered the worst stretches of freeway in the city. The morning of March 15th, 2015, started like any other. I grabbed my usual gas station coffee and headed toward the 405. The radio was playing some forgettable pop song when the emergency broadcast cut in. High-speed pursuit in progress. Suspect armed and dangerous. Avoid all northbound lanes. I thought about taking surface streets, but I was already running late for my first appointment. A fender bender claim in Westwood that would probably take all morning. The kind of routine paperwork that keeps the lights on but slowly kills your soul. I figured the chase would be over by the time I reached the affected area. Traffic was lighter than usual. That should have been my first warning. In LA, when the freeway is empty at 7 a.m., something is very wrong. But I was tired, distracted by thoughts of my upcoming performance review and whether I'd get that raise I desperately needed. My rent had gone up again, and my car was making that grinding noise that meant expensive repairs were coming. The chase had been going on for 47 minutes when I first saw the helicopters. News choppers circling like vultures over the northbound lanes about 2 miles ahead. I could see the flashing lights of police cruisers stretched out in a long line, moving fast but not fast enough to catch whatever they were pursuing. I learned later that it had started with a domestic violence call in Van Nuys. A middle-aged man around age 34 had beaten his girlfriend so badly she was hospitalized with a fractured skull and internal bleeding. When officers arrived at his apartment, they found methamphetamine, stolen firearms, and evidence of a robbery spree that had been terrorizing the San Fernando Valley for weeks. The man had fled in a stolen Honda Civic, leading police on a chase that reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour through residential neighborhoods. He'd already sideswiped 3 cars and blown through a school zone during recess. Parents were pulling their children inside as he screamed past, his car smoking and lurching from the damage he'd accumulated. I was stuck in the resulting traffic backup, watching the drama unfold on the freeway ahead. The pursuit had reached the connector ramp between the 405 and the 101. That's when everything went wrong in a way that still makes my hands shake when I drive past that spot. The man's car finally gave out just as he reached the ramp. Steam pouring from the engine, transmission grinding, tires shredded down to the rims. The police had him boxed in with nowhere to go. Spike strips ahead, cruisers behind and on both sides. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw him get out of the car. Even from my position in the backup traffic, I could see the gun in his right hand. A silver revolver that caught the morning sunlight. The police were shouting through their loudspeakers, but I couldn't make out the words over the distance and the helicopter rotors. The man walked to the edge of the ramp. Below him was a 40-foot drop to the surface street, where morning commuters had stopped their cars and were getting out to look up at the unfolding drama. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds, swaying slightly like he was drunk or high or both. The news choppers were broadcasting it live. Thousands of people across the city were watching their morning shows when it happened. He raised the gun to his right temple and pulled the trigger. His body fell forward over the ramp barrier and landed on the roof of a Honda Accord stopped at a red light below. The driver, a nurse heading to her shift at Cedars-Sinai, was physically unharmed but never returned to work. The impact caved in her roof and covered her windshield with blood and brain matter. I sat in my car for 3 hours while they processed the scene. The coffee I'd grabbed that morning went cold, then warm again in the rising heat. My appointment in Westwood was canceled, then rescheduled, then canceled again when the client decided they didn't want to deal with insurance after watching the news. The cleanup took until almost noon. They had to bring in a hazmat team for the biological material, and a crane to lift the man's body off the Honda. The nurse who'd been in the car below was taken to the hospital for observation and trauma counseling. Her car was totaled, not from mechanical damage, but because no one could clean it enough to make it drivable again. When traffic finally started moving, I drove past the ramp where it happened. There was a dark stain on the concrete barrier and scattered glass that the cleanup crew had missed. A few flowers had already appeared at the base of the overpass, left by people who'd seen the news. But sometimes, when I'm driving and I see an overpass ahead, I still slow down and look up at the barriers, wondering if someone is standing up there, holding a gun, making the decision that will ruin a dozen lives beyond their own. The morning commute never really ended for me. It just became something I carry everywhere I go. I was a software developer working for a small tech company in Seattle back in 2012. The kind of startup where everyone wore hoodies and drank too much coffee and believed we were going to change the world with our app that helped people track their grocery spending. Looking back, it all seems pretty naive, but at the time we were convinced we were building something important. My apartment was in Tacoma, about an hour south of the office on a good day. I'd chosen to live there because rent was cheaper and I liked being closer to the water, even though it meant a long commute up I-5 every morning. The drive wasn't too bad most days. You got used to the stop-and-go traffic, the construction zones, the way drivers in the Pacific Northwest seemed to forget how to function the moment it started raining. December 11th was a Tuesday, and I had an important client presentation scheduled for 10 a.m. Some investors were coming in from Portland to look at our latest build, and my boss had been stressing about it for weeks. I'd stayed late the night before running through my slides one more time, making sure all the demo features worked properly, double-checking that we wouldn't embarrass ourselves in front of people with actual money. I left my apartment at 6:30 a.m. to give myself extra time for traffic. The weather forecast had mentioned possible fog, but that was nothing unusual for Western Washington in December. Fog was just another part of winter, like the constant drizzle and the way the sun disappeared for months at a time. The first part of the drive was normal. Light traffic, overcast skies, the radio playing some indie rock station out of Seattle. I grabbed coffee from a drive-thru near the freeway entrance and settled in for the long crawl north. My presentation notes were on the passenger seat, and I kept glancing over them at red lights, rehearsing key points about user engagement and revenue projections. Around Fife, I started noticing wisps of fog drifting across the highway. Nothing dramatic at first, just thin patches that would swirl around the car and then clear. The kind of fog that made you turn on your headlights but didn't really slow you down. I'd driven through much worse. But as I got closer to Federal Way, the fog began to thicken. What had been occasional wisps became a steady gray curtain that reduced visibility to maybe 100 yards, then 50, then 20. Cars around me started slowing down, turning on their hazard lights, creeping along at speeds that would normally cause road rage, but now felt dangerously fast. By the time I reached the Tacoma Narrows area, the fog was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the gradual, rolling fog you see in movies. It was like driving into a solid wall of gray nothing. One moment I could see the taillights of the car ahead of me. The next moment they'd vanished completely, as if they'd never existed. I slowed to maybe 15 miles per hour, following the faint glow of reflective lane markers, and trying to maintain a safe distance from whatever invisible vehicles might be around me. My hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel. The fog was so dense that I couldn't even see my own hood. It was like being inside a cloud, which I suppose is exactly what it was. Temperature inversion, the weather service would explain later. Warm air trapping cold, moist air at ground level, creating conditions that turned a busy freeway into a whiteout nightmare. I was somewhere around the Narrows Bridge approaches when I first heard the screech of brakes up ahead. Not the quick chirp of someone stopping normally, but the long, desperate wail of tires fighting for traction on wet pavement. Then came the first crash, a hollow metallic boom that echoed through the fog like thunder. I hit my brakes and felt my car slide slightly on the damp road. The ABS kicked in, chattering under my foot as I tried to stop without rear-ending whatever chaos was unfolding ahead of me. More brake sounds, more impacts. The the fog carrying the sounds of destruction without revealing their source. Then I saw lights. Not headlights or taillights, but the red and orange glow of flames cutting through the gray. A car had caught fire somewhere in the pileup ahead, and the fog was reflecting the light in all directions, creating an apocalyptic glow that made everything look like a scene from hell. I managed to stop about 50 feet from the edge of the accident zone. Through brief gaps in the fog, I could make out the shapes of mangled vehicles, cars compressed like accordions, trucks jackknifed across multiple lanes, debris scattered everywhere. The sound was worse than the sight, metal groaning under pressure, steam hissing from ruptured radiators, and underneath it all, the voices of people calling for help. More cars were arriving behind me every few seconds, their drivers unable to see the pileup until they were almost part of it. I got out and started waving my arms, trying to warn approaching vehicles to stop. But in the fog, I was just another ghost figure that appeared and disappeared without warning. A semi-truck materialized out of the gray, moving too fast for the conditions. The driver was laying on his horn and trying to brake, but 40 tons of cargo doesn't stop quickly on wet pavement. I dove toward the shoulder as the truck jackknifed past me, sliding sideways into the existing wreckage with a crash that shook the ground. The pileup kept growing as more vehicles arrived faster than emergency responders could close the freeway. Cars would emerge from the fog bank at highway speeds, see the wall of wreckage ahead of them, and slam on their brakes with nowhere to go. Some managed to stop in time. Others became part of the twisted metal sculpture that was spreading across all lanes of the interstate. I spent the next 2 hours helping pull people from cars when I could reach them safely. A woman trapped in a crushed Camry, her legs pinned under the dashboard, talking calmly about her son's soccer game while we waited for firefighters with cutting tools. An elderly man whose Hilux had been rear-ended by a delivery van, conscious but confused, asking repeatedly where he was and why it was so dark outside. The fog was so thick that rescue crews had to work by feel as much as by sight. EMTs would disappear into the gray with their equipment and emerge 20 minutes later carrying stretchers, like figures from a dream. Tow trucks tried to clear lanes for ambulances, but kept getting lost in the maze of wreckage. 63 vehicles were involved in the final count. 5 people died, including a young mother whose car had been crushed between 2 semis. Dozens more were injured, some critically. The freeway was closed for 8 hours while crews worked to clear the wreckage and treat the wounded. My client presentation was canceled, obviously. The investors rescheduled for the following week, and by then the startup had moved on to panicking about other things. But I never forgot the way that fog transformed a routine Tuesday morning commute into something out of a nightmare. I still drive I-5 for work, but I'm obsessive about weather reports now. Any mention of fog, and I take surface streets, even if it adds an hour to my commute. The memory of that day. It changed the way I think about the assumptions we make every time we get behind the wheel. My car survived with only minor damage, but I sold it a month later and bought something with better traction control and more airbags. These days, I work remotely most of the time. The technology we were building back then finally got good enough to make office commutes optional, which is ironic since I'd been so worried about missing that presentation. But sometimes, on December mornings when I see fog rolling in from Puget Sound, I think about that Tuesday when the weather turned a busy freeway into a graveyard. How quickly normal life can vanish into gray nothing. How many people woke up that morning planning ordinary days that turned extraordinary in the worst possible way.